Chapter 22. The Trials of Rothmane, Part 1. William smiled politely at the three knights, blushing abashedly as he cleared more space in the messy cart. Ivar had hopped up into the seat that William had been occupying next to Eric and had begun giving him directions. The other two knights had climbed up into the back of the cart, along with William. He looked awkwardly between the two knights who were inspecting Eric's luggage curiously. "Is that what I think it is?" asked August, nodding towards Eric's tower shield, which was wrapped up in canvas. "Aye, sir, it's his great-granddad's shield," replied William eagerly, immediately biting his tongue when he remembered that he was supposed to be using fancier words. August kicked the shield lightly before chuckling. "An old-world full-metal scutum. How our ancestors got by with such unwieldy armaments is beyond me. You won't be using that at the college, trust me," he said, shaking his head. William stayed silent. He remembered the old gypsy man's reaction to seeing the shield's sigil. It was best that these knights simply thought they were fools for bringing a giant old shield along, rather than knowing anything more about it. "You really are just here to enroll in the college, aren't you?" asked Azalea, looking around at Eric's humble belongings. William tilted his head in confusion. "Aye," he confirmed. "I mean, yes," he corrected, blushing at his lack of etiquette. Azalea and August exchanged an amused glance. William looked around in awe at the beautiful jettied buildings which loomed over them, some 3 stories high. Azalea smiled warmly as she watched him looking around curiously. "Have you ever seen buildings like these before?" she asked. William shook his head. "Never. Back home a few people had 2 levels on their houses, but it weren't common. I never knew they got even bigger than that," recalled William, craning his head to see the tops of the buildings. Azalea let out a sigh of relief as she watched Eric listening intently to Ivar's instructions while William was being mesmerized by the city around him. "So, you two really want to enroll in the college?" asked August, drawing William's attention. He nodded affirmatively. "Yes, that's right," he said, silently congratulating himself on using the correct words. August raised an eyebrow. "You're a bit old to be pages, aren't you? I suppose, considering that the Rothmane name still holds some weight, and with the 3 of us on your side, you may be able to convince them to let you enter in the next intake of squires instead. Might I see your papers?" asked August expectantly. William looked back at him blankly. "Papers?" he asked, confused. "Yes, your scroll of pedigree," confirmed August expectantly. William began blushing. I don't have one," replied William meekly. Azalea and August shared a concerned glance. Even Ivar turned around and started listening in to the conversation at this point. "Pardon?" asked August, thinking that perhaps he'd misheard him. "I'm a commoner, sir, so," confirmed William. "But you told me you wanted to enter the college," exclaimed Ivar, suspecting that he'd been hoodwinked in some way. "I do," confirmed William. "Commoners can't be knights," yelled Ivar exasperatedly. "I know that, but—" "Eric, didn't you say you had an idea?" asked William, desperate for some help. Eric cleared his throat awkwardly. "I mean—" he stammered. "Would you perhaps be able to help us enroll, William?" asked Eric to Ivar hopefully. Ivar recoiled dramatically. "What? We might be administrators, but that doesn't mean we can change the rules," yelled Ivar. Eric looked like he wanted to respond, but was suddenly distracted by something ahead of them. "Is that it?" he asked suddenly, pointing to another enormous wall with yet another guard checkpoint and a small office. Ivar let out a sigh. "I really wish you had told me that you weren't a noble sooner," said Ivar in frustration. "I did," replied William defensively. "When?" exclaimed Ivar. "Back in Lackdorian," explained William earnestly. "Lackdorian? You expect me to remember that far back?" asked Ivar, dumbfounded. William suddenly felt a pang of distaste shoot through his body. Had these 3 supposed knights really already put the happenings of Lacdorian behind them? Did they not care about the destruction that had been left in their wake? Did they not care about what had happened to Anne-Marie when she was supposed to be under their watch? How dare they move on with their lives as though they hadn't ruined his? He was suddenly pulled from his thoughts when Eric drew Bonnie to a stop and hopped down from his seat as a guard approached them. "Good afternoon," said the guard, bowing his head politely to each of the 3 knights. "We're here to enroll 2 new students," said Ivar. The guard looked at Eric and William with his eyebrows raised. "3 first-class knights? Here for an enrollment?" he asked, confused. The 3 knights simply stared back at him. He cleared his throat and shuffled awkwardly on the spot. "Of course. Please, head straight through into the office," said the guard, bowing awkwardly and stepping away from their cart. After the motley crew disembarked, leaving Bonnie in a bay to the side, Ivar led them into the small office building by the gate. Eric and William exchanged a nervous glance with one another. This was it. It all came down to this moment. Without enrollment in the college, their chances of accessing the library records were practically 0. They had to somehow make this work. William opened his eyes in surprise as he entered the small, cramped office. The archivist on duty was clearly of Zerubian descent. Being from the endemic town of Lacdorian, William had never had the privilege of meeting any outsiders aside from the gypsies. Even foreign travelling merchants skipped their unnoteworthy dot on the map. As the group filed into the tight office space, the archivist dropped what he was doing and stood up in surprise. 3 first-class knights being in his little office was quite unusual, especially when accompanied by a couple of farm boys. "Good afternoon. How may I help you?" asked the archivist nervously, looking over their shoulders through the window at the guard stationed outside, who simply shrugged. "We're here to get these 2 boys enrolled," said August, stepping forward confidently. "Oh, certainly," said the archivist, sitting back down in his chair at the front desk, relieved that it wasn't something more serious. "May I see their papers, please?" he asked. William and Eric exchanged a nervous glance with one another. "Come now, is that really necessary?" piped up August suddenly, taking another step forward. The archivist looked quite confused. "Yes," he confirmed, looking around at the bunch as though he'd missed something. "I'm afraid the boys have lost their papers. That's why we're here. We can confirm their identity for you," said Azalea, also stepping forward and smiling warmly at the archivist. He furrowed his brow nervously, looking up at the 3 knights. "I'm afraid that's not quite how this works," said the archivist, clearly uncomfortable. As the 3 knights continued to argue the point, William nudged Eric. "What?" whispered Eric. "I think you're going to have to try that idea you had," whispered William, noticing that the 3 knights were getting nowhere. Eric's face went a little pale. "It's a terrible idea, William." "Really?" admitted Eric, shaking his head. "What idea?" asked August suddenly, drawing all attention back to the boys. Eric swallowed nervously as the entire room focused their attention on him. "Well, I mean," began Eric, stammering under the pressure of the situation. He let out a sigh and tried to steady his nerves before stepping forward towards the archivist's desk. "It wasn't always the case that commoners couldn't enroll in the college, right?" asked Eric. The archivist looked back at him confused. "You're commoners?" he asked. Eric immediately realized he'd misspoken and stammered to correct himself, but William put his hand on Eric's shoulder and took a step forward to join him. "He isn't, but I am," admitted William shamefully. The archivist looked puzzled. "Look!" began Eric, pulling William's hand from his shoulder. "Back when my great-grandfather enrolled, he wrote about how there were ways to become a knight that weren't just from being of noble birth," claimed Eric desperately. The archivist shook his head confidently. "No, Perhaps he was simply alluding to the entry exams. All new enrollments must go through the entrance exams, but they have to be noble to qualify for those in the first place, said the archivist, continuing to shake his head. That's not what he was talking about, shouted Eric, realizing that he was becoming a little too worked up. He said, trailed off Eric, as his face again became a little pale as he tried to find his words. The archivist let out a sigh. I'm afraid I can only process enrollment requests from, began the archivist. What about the trial by combat? Interrupted Eric suddenly. The archivist recoiled in surprise. Trial by what? Exclaimed August. No. Again, you're thinking of the combat exam, part of the graduation process from squires to, began the archivist. Eric shook his head confidently. No, I'm not talking about that. When the Great War was first beginning, they needed to train more knights. They ended up amending a clause to the college's constitution which stated that the most talented fighters of the common class may be accepted into the college if they passed a trial by combat, recited Eric conclusively. The three knights exchanged searching glances with one another, each shrugging as they'd never heard of this either. The archivist chuckled nervously. Boy, I'm impressed by your research. You'll be a good fit for the Order of the Owl, but I'm afraid you're confused. Firstly, that amendment was intended to allow the strongest fighters from the military ranks to be promoted into knighthood, not for random commoners to become squires. Secondly, amendments from that long ago can hardly be upheld. I assure you an amendment as obscure as that has long since been revised. I mean, come on, we could never uphold such an ancient, obsolete and frankly barbaric clause in the modern day, reasoned the archivist emphatically. There was an awkward silence as the archivist's words lingered in the room. Come on, boys, we tried our best, said Azalea, putting a hand on each of their shoulders. Challenge, replied Eric simply. What? Asked the archivist, surprised. I challenge your word. By the name of House Rothmane, I challenge your ruling, said Eric, placing his scroll of pedigree down on the desk before the archivist. The archivist looked expectantly at the three knights, but each of them simply stared back in confusion. You're challenging my ruling? What is this, a court of law? What are all of these obscure, archaic rules you're enacting here? Challenges haven't been a thing for 80 years, exclaimed the archivist. Are you sure about that? Asked Eric, raising a combative eyebrow. The archivist looked back at him, tilting his head in disbelief at Eric's boldness. Rothmane, huh? I guess it really does run in your blood, muttered the archivist with a sigh. Eric nodded with a proud smile. Fine. I honestly don't recall ever hearing that challenges had officially been declared obsolete, so I suppose I'll have to uphold your challenge for now, replied the archivist, shaking his head in annoyance. Pardon me, but what does all of this mean? Asked August suddenly. The archivist let out a sigh. Challenges are a very antiquated way for a noble to put their family's name on the line to challenge a ruling. It was typically used in the court of law, but I suppose there's nothing to technically forbid its use in a menial legal matter like this, explained the archivist. The three knights shared some intrigued glances. Basically, the boys claim that trials by combat have never strictly been struck from the college constitution, must be officially fact-checked in the Great Library, the archivist concluded, realizing that the majority of the room was still not quite following what was happening. There was a moment of silence as everybody caught up. What happens if his challenge is met, and it turns out he was incorrect? Asked Ivar curiously. The archivist shrugged. I guess in some cases it could mean that his family would lose some of their titles, or in the absolute worst case, that they're stripped of their knighthood. The archivist looked up and raised an eyebrow at Eric, who clearly didn't have much to lose. You really would be a good fit for the Order of the Owl, you know, he reiterated, impressed. Eric bowed his head appreciatively. "So, what now?" asked August. "Now," began the archivist, standing from his chair and closing the book he'd been writing in. "We have to go to the great library," he finished with a sigh, looking around at the three knights. "But surely you have a copy of the Constitution somewhere nearer than that?" asked Ivar hopefully. The archivist shook his head. "Even if the specific clause relating to trials by combat aren't on the modern-day copies which I have access to, that doesn't mean they've necessarily been removed. The copyist may simply have deemed it unimportant to include in our handouts. It really is quite an obscure and archaic rule. Plus, if the boy is right, I've got a long evening of reading century-old legal manuals about combat trials ahead of me there anyway," admitted the archivist with a disappointed sigh. As everybody in the room began to walk towards the door, William grabbed Eric by the arm. "Hey!" whispered William harshly. Eric looked at him quizzically. "Trial by combat?" asked William, panic starting to rise in his chest. Eric gestured for him to calm down. "Don't worry, this is all going to plan," said Eric assuredly. William stared back at him perplexed. How could this situation possibly end in their favour? Either they were going to end up being rejected from the college, or in the best-case scenario, William was going to have to engage in some kind of trial by combat. He'd never so much as touched a sword in his life. How was he supposed to pass any kind of combat trial? Chapter 23. The Trials of Rothmane, Part 2. As their small group worked their way down the peaceful road, William and Eric looked around in astonishment. Beyond the guard post and some initial administration buildings was an expanse of open, well-tended grassy fields. "How large is this city?" asked William in awe. "More than 6 miles," replied the archivist proudly. "6 miles?" exclaimed William, gobsmacked. "Feels like more than that," said Ivar, annoyed at having to make the trek to the college campus and the great library. "Come on, aren't you at least a little curious about how this is going to work out?" asked Azalea, elbowing Ivar. He shrugged. "I suppose so, but not as curious as I am about how the bottle of wine I'd bought for this evening tastes," replied Ivar despondently. Having left Bonnie happily stationed at a water trough by the guard post, their group was travelling on foot. They'd already been walking for close to 10 minutes and were only now nearing the walls at the far end of the greenery. "Whoa!" said Eric, as they approached the walls and were finally able to see the full extent of what lay beyond them. The walls had been blocking the view of the enormous marble building ahead of them. The giant circular building was a hub of activity, surrounded by scholars going in and out, chattering quietly with one another in the golden afternoon sunlight, and going about their daily business. The front of the building was supported by a giant line of marble pillars which extended magnificently high to support the heavy marble-tiled roof. A large ornate fountain stood out the front, featuring a sculpture of a bearded man with an owl on his arm. "Is that—" began William, awestruck. "Yep, that's the Oxgate Library," replied the archivist proudly. As their group approached the front steps of the grand building, the weight of the situation once again began to settle on William's shoulders. He took a deep, nervous breath as he looked up at the intimidating building ahead of them. Did Eric really have a plan? How could this end in anything but disaster? William was pulled from his thoughts when the archivist suddenly turned around to face their group. "Now, there are some important rules of etiquette when entering the great library," he began. The three knights all let out frustrated sighs as they'd heard the spiel 1,000,000 times before. "Firstly, for non-librarians or researchers, you may not delve any deeper than the entrance hall," explained the archivist. Eric nodded knowingly in response, having read these rules 100 times himself. "You must remain respectfully quiet. All weapons must be left with the guards stationed at the entrance of the library. No food or drink is to be brought into the library. If your hygiene standards are deemed inadequate, you will be asked to leave. Everybody understand?" asked the archivist. William and Eric nodded their heads enthusiastically. The archivist looked down at the two of them in thought for a moment. "You may be asked to leave, but we'll see," he thought aloud, looking over their muddy, low-classed, heavily worn commoner clothes. Eric and William both blushed shamefully, but were reassured by a pat on the shoulder by August. William winced as the pressure sent a wave of pain through his brand, but he managed to keep himself from showing how much it had hurt by simply smiling and continuing on walking. As they approached the front door, they were halted by guards who requested that they give up any weapons they may be holding. William, Eric, and the archivist showed that they had no weapons, but all three knights were forced to hand over daggers which they had hidden away on their person. It was the first time that William had seen any of them holding a weapon before, and the fact that they were actually knights began to set in again. He and Eric were actually being guided into the great library by three knights right now. Goosebumps ran down his arms as the enormity of the situation dawned on him. He looked over at Eric and saw that his face was several shades paler than usual. He must have been feeling the same thing. As soon as they entered the building, both William and Eric gasped audibly in shock. The interior of the library was the most lavish, intricate and beautiful architecture that either of the boys had ever seen. Even here in the mere entrance hall, the enormously high curved marble ceiling was painted with elaborate works of art. Gold trimming ran down every inch of the beautifully carved interior walls. The design of the building meant that the natural light from the golden afternoon sun was lighting up the room in an enchanting way, the vibrant colours of the room reflecting from its shiny, marble-tiled floor. Librarians sat at desks all around the room, quietly discussing books and research papers with visitors to the library. They all sat at beautiful mahogany desks with ornate golden lanterns lighting up their workstations. Eric and William shared a gobsmacked glance with one another. Coming from their common homes out in Lacdorian, to be standing in a place as lavish as this was almost unfathomable. "Okay, follow me," said the archivist, approaching a desk that was administered by an older-looking, bearded librarian. He was wearing a badge bearing the crest of the Order of the Owl. The librarian looked up in surprise at the unusual group that had approached his desk. "Good afternoon," said the archivist. The librarian didn't respond, simply continuing to look over their group quizzically. "We're here because this boy has issued a challenge to a ruling I have made," explained the archivist. The librarian's head snapped back to look at the archivist. "A what now?" he asked in surprise. The archivist chuckled knowingly before letting out a sigh. "Yes, I was surprised too," admitted the archivist. The man looked at Eric and tilted his head in confusion. "A challenge?" asked the old librarian. Eric simply nodded in response. The librarian looked him up and down, raising an eyebrow as he sized up the scruffy boy who stood before him. "How have you even come to learn of such a thing?" asked the librarian. Eric shuffled nervously on his feet. "Well, I've read through all of my great-grandfather's old books and journals from during the Great War," explained Eric. "Your great-grandfather was a knight?" asked the librarian, intrigued. "Sir Heinrich Rothmane," confirmed Eric with a nod. The librarian's eyebrows shot up in recognition as he looked Eric up and down once more. William couldn't help but smile in adoration at Eric. The fact that he'd even managed to get them this far was astonishing. He was every bit as brilliant as William had always known he was, and finally other people were recognizing it. The old man hummed, deep in thought, before looking back up at the archivist. "Well, I suppose it's possible that challenges must still be upheld, but it's the first I've heard of them since I was a mere page," admitted the man. It was at this moment that it suddenly dawned on William that every single one of the librarians here were knights too. He looked around at all of the intelligent-looking nobles stationed around the room and felt a chill run down his spine again. How had Eric managed to get them so close to their goal already? The old librarian leaned forward in his chair. "So what was the ruling which is being challenged?" asked the librarian, dipping his quill into his pot of ink in preparation for documenting their exchange. "Well," began the archivist, clearing his throat awkwardly, "the ruling is that commoners may not be enrolled into the college via trial by combat," said the archivist, shaking his head in disbelief at the words which were coming out of his own mouth. Immediately the librarian snapped his head back up and stared at the archivist in shock. There was a short pause while the man simply sat, open-mouthed, looking over the bunch in confusion, while his readied quill dripped ink on his parchment. "Trial by combat?" gasped the man, looking Eric up and down again before tilting his head as he seemed to be deeming him suitably sized for such a task. "The college hasn't seen a trial by combat since before even my parents' time," said the old man, shaking his head. "Yes, but the boys' challenge is that they may still be written in the college constitution," explained the archivist. The old man laughed. "Preposterous!" he exclaimed, shaking his head. "Yes, indeed. But still," replied the archivist, uncomfortably shifting on the spot again. The man shook his head at first, but then tilted his head deep in thought, looking back at Eric again. "Sir?" asked the archivist, after waiting for a moment. The old librarian was pulled back to reality, letting out a sigh. "I suppose we'd better check the Constitution then," said the librarian. The archivist bowed his head thankfully as the old librarian reached over to the side of his desk and pulled a small piece of silk rope. The rope was attached to a mechanism at the top of his desk, which, when engaged, raised a little flag with the Order of the Owl Crest upon it. William jumped back in surprise when the little flag popped out, bumping into Azalea, who giggled at his antics. Suddenly, a young man who couldn't have been much older than William hurried over to their desk. He was wearing similar blue robes to all the other librarians, but he was considerably younger. As he reached the side of their desk, he bowed politely to their group before closing the flag mechanism back up with his hand and looking at the librarian expectantly. "Squire, fetch us a copy of the current college constitution," commanded the librarian. The squire nodded obediently and went to set off, but suddenly the archivist grabbed him by his sleeve to stop him. "What about the trial by combat?" asked the archivist. The librarian let out a sigh. "We're not going to need to go that far," said the librarian, shaking his head. The archivist looked at Eric, seemingly sizing him up, before turning back to the librarian. "I wouldn't be so sure. On the off chance that the boy is right, I certainly don't know those rules by heart, do you?" asked the archivist. The librarian seemed to consider his words, before once again releasing an annoyed sigh. "Fine. Squire, also fetch—" The librarian seemed to stop in his tracks. There was a long moment of silence as the squire patiently awaited the librarian's order. The librarian looked searchingly at the archivist, who simply shrugged in response. "The Pathway of Pedigree 4, a modern manual to the art of chivalry, written by Magister Ulfric. First edition, sir," said Eric suddenly, bowing his head apologetically. The librarian swallowed nervously. "Magister Ulfric's Pathway of Pedigree, you say?" confirmed the librarian uneasily. Eric nodded confidently. The librarian stared back at him for a moment, before once again letting out a sigh. "Yes, that. But whatever edition is newest," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly. The squire nodded obediently before hurrying off and disappearing down a hallway at the back of the room. "Don't get your hopes up, boy," said the librarian suddenly, raising an eyebrow at Eric. The archivist nodded his head in agreement. "Even if it turns out that you found a tricky little loophole here, that's all it'll be," said the librarian conceitedly. "What do you mean?" asked Eric, confused. "Look, even if these things haven't technically been officially removed from the college's guidelines, that doesn't mean they're obligated to follow through on any of this," explained the archivist. If it's in the college constitution, how could they not follow through? Asked Eric, bewildered. Something as groundbreaking as a commoner entering the college would need to go through the Magister's office at the very least. It would likely require that the rector himself sign off on it. Even still, if somehow you managed to get the rector's approval, which you likely wouldn't, the idea of a commoner in the college would be quite offensive to many high-ranking officials, explained the archivist soberly. William felt his hope at the situation, leaving his body more and more with every word that came out of the archivist's mouth. "None of that will matter anyway," said the librarian dismissively. "Want to bet on it?" asked Eric combatively. The librarian scowled at him disdainfully. "Listen, boy, if you're so smart, I suppose you realize that a trial by combat was actually held between man and monster, yes?" he asked, smirking at Eric smugly. "Yes, sir, I'm relying on it," replied Eric confidently, surprising everybody, but most of all William. "What?" exclaimed the librarian. "Yeah, Eric. What?" asked William, suddenly feeling his doubt in Eric's plan intensifying. At that moment, the squire emerged back into their room and hurried over to their desk, holding a scroll and a book. He handed both to the librarian before running back over to his station at the side of the room. The librarian and archivist hurriedly got to work reading through the Constitution. As soon as the group descended into silence, Ivar turned around and began walking towards the door. "Don't go anywhere," said the archivist, looking up at the knights. "You're going to make us wait here?" asked Ivar despondently. "Yes. For my report, I need to interview you on how the three of you have become wrapped up in this situation," replied the archivist absent-mindedly. August and Azalea exchanged worried glances. "Report?" asked Ivar nervously. "No," said the librarian suddenly, stopping rifling through the scroll he was reading. He and the archivist both stared at the scroll speechlessly for a moment. "There it is," breathed the archivist, swallowing nervously. There was another moment of silence before he slapped a hand on his forehead in exasperation. "Do you have any idea what this means for me? If word gets out that challenges are still a thing, I'll be buried in paperwork until the day I die. I'm the first line of defense for those snob-nosed noble parents to come to with their complaints about the college. They'll challenge me about all sorts of trivial affairs. I'll never get another day of rest," groaned the archivist in despair. "Shh," hushed the librarian, annoyed by the archivist's theatrics. "That's nothing. Look," he said, his eyes open wide in shock. He was pointing to another section, buried deep in the bowels of the Constitution. "The college shall uphold all enrollment processes set forth by the Magister's office," read the archivist. William and Eric exchanged excited grins. "It's actually there," said the archivist, dumbstruck. "Hold on now, we still don't know if this applies to the trial by combat," insisted the librarian, putting the Constitution scroll aside and picking up the book. "Okay, let's see," said the librarian, opening the book and searching for any kind of contents page or appendix. "Page 347, sir," said Eric helpfully. The librarian took the time to scowl at him before reluctantly scrolling to page 347 and raising his eyebrows in surprise. Both the librarian and the archivist silently stared at the words in the book, their jaws dropping more with every line. "What does it say?" asked August curiously. The entire affair really had become so bizarre that even the three knights were invested at this point. The fact that they'd been following the boys with suspicions of being extorted at first had apparently completely left their minds. "The trial by combat is a newly approved process by which the kingdom's mightiest fighters may join the ranks of knighthood, should they prove their value in battle with the denizens of the gateway. An event shall be held by the college in which applicants will face off in one-on-one mortal combat with a denizen of the gateway. The monster is to be provided by the college. The event shall be held within an arena such that neither man nor monster may flee. the battle is deemed to have been a victory when only the fighter remains on the battlefield. If the gateway creature provided by the college is of a breed which separates into smaller beings upon being slain or features any similar characteristics, the fighter may only be declared a victor when a monster has been completely defeated, read the archivist aloud, also beginning to draw the attention of some other nearby librarians who had begun listening in. The librarian looked back up at Eric. "Surely you see how this can't happen," explained the librarian with a shrug. "I see no such thing," replied Eric confidently. The librarian stared at him dumbfounded. "Boy, have you lost your mind? It clearly states that a gateway monster must be provided by the college. Magister Ulfric wrote these rules in a time when the gateway was still open. I don't know if you'd forgotten, but it's been closed for a century," shouted the librarian. Eric smiled assuredly. "That's not our problem," he replied flatly. The librarian and archivist exchanged a flabbergasted look. "What?" exclaimed the librarian. "Our task is simply to pass the trial. The text clearly states that the trial will be passed once William here is the only one left standing in the arena. If you can't provide a monster for him to face, well then, I suppose he'd just win by default then, right?" asked Eric. William felt that familiar feeling of awe and pride at Eric welling in his chest. Even the three knights exchanged shocked laughs at his audacity. "The rector would never allow this." "Never!" yelled the librarian, clearly offended by the way that Eric was twisting the college's constitution to his favor. "Are you sure? Judging by the statue of the man stationed directly out the front of this very library, I would have thought that the rector would have held Magister Ulfric's rules in quite some high regard," poked Eric. "Preposterous! This is an affront to the college, an attack on chivalry itself. I have personally met the rector many times, and I can assure you that you'll never get his signature on this. Never!" bellowed the librarian, banging his fist on the desk angrily, startling some of the other library workers. "Get out, all of you, get out," commanded the librarian, angrily waving his hand for their group to leave. The ruckus was drawing the attention of the guards, who began walking towards their desk. "You can't kick us out! You must follow through on this! It's your job!" exclaimed Eric angrily. The archivist grabbed him by the arm and began leading him away from the desk. "Don't worry, boy, you're right. He might be angry, but he still has to pass this on." "Come on," said the archivist, looking anxiously at the approaching guards. Eric reluctantly backed away from the table as their group began retreating towards the front of the library. "Come on," said the guards, appreciating that the group seemed to be cooperating. Everybody silently walked back out the front doors of the building and out into the dusk light on the marble stairs outside. As the knights retrieved their confiscated weapons, Eric released an angry grunt, looking back over his shoulder at the door of the library as though he wanted to run back inside. "Eric, it's all right. You heard him. He has to send it on to the guy," said William, already forgetting the title of the man that had been talked about in the previous conversation. Eric looked at William and let out a frustrated sigh. "It's not about that. It's not fair." "Because he's right," said Eric despondently. The archivist put a consoling hand on Eric's shoulder. "I must say, as much as I wanted to see your plan come to fruition, the rector would never sign off on this," agreed the archivist. "How can that be?" asked William. "What's the point of having all of these rules if some high-up noble can just say no anyway?" he questioned, starting to inherit some of the anger and frustration that Eric was feeling. "Welcome to Oxgate," said the archivist with a wry smile. As the three of them continued to discuss their predicament, suddenly Ivar grabbed August and Azalea by their arms and pulled them aside. The three knights began chattering away together excitedly, seeming to be forming a plan of their own. Just what were William and Eric going to be able to do from here, and how would the rector respond to their challenge? Chapter 24. The Trials of Rothmane, Part 3. Evening was beginning to fall, and the last rays of the golden hour were dancing on the water of the ornate fountain in front of them. William, Eric, and the archivist stood on the marble steps, quietly discussing their options. The archivist suddenly noticed that the three knights were huddled together, having an excited, whispered conversation. "Hey!" exclaimed the archivist, suddenly drawing them out of their conversation with a jolt. "What are you going to do with these two?" asked the archivist, gesturing to William and Eric. "Right," said Ivar, suddenly hurrying over towards Eric and William. "Listen, boys, we're going to need you to stick around for a while," said Ivar, looking between the pair of them. William stared back blankly. "You want us to stay here?" asked Eric, confused. Ivar nodded affirmatively. "Where are we to stay?" asked Eric, looking around at the lavish library surrounded by naught but empty fields. "There's a decent inn called the Blue Lantern within the noble district, not too far from this fellow's office," said August, nodding towards the archivist. "It's Roland," said the archivist, despondently. "No, it's definitely called the Blue Lantern," replied August assuredly. My name is Roland. We've been over this so many times, August. We studied together, for crying out loud," yelled the archivist. "Forgive him, Roland. The only thing this man cares about is how hard you can swing your sword. He's never remembered the name of a single knight who chose the research route," said Azalea, rolling her eyes. "Is that so wrong of me? What can I say? I love to battle," defended August with a shrug. "What about Bonnie?" asked William, bringing their attention back to the topic at hand. A long silence formed as August stared at him blankly. "Our horse," added Eric helpfully. "Oh, the Blue Lantern has an attached stable, of course," replied August with a nod. "Wow, an inn with an attached stable?" exclaimed William, awe-struck by the facilities provided in the city. "Yeah, about that. An inn in the upper district. We don't have that kind of money," admitted Eric honestly. William hung his head shamefully. He was leeching off of the little hard-earned money that Eric had brought with them. He'd left his own home with nothing but the clothes on his back. Thus far he'd contributed nothing to their journey but woe. "Ivar, you already have a running bond of debt with them, yes?" asked Azalea expectantly. Ivar looked around desperately at everybody else, but eventually let out a defeated sigh. "Fine, I'll pay for it, but only until I tell you to get out. Do you understand?" asked Ivar. Eric and William both nodded obediently. "Well now, we have somewhere we need to be, so," began Ivar, beginning to turn away before Roland grabbed him by the arm. "Not so fast. You have to come back to my office. I need to write my report, remember?" asked Roland. Ivar groaned in frustration. "Now is not the time," exclaimed Ivar, looking at the other two knights expectantly. "Roland, dear, can't we please do this another time?" asked Azalea, smiling at him pleadingly. Roland let out a sigh. "This is a big deal, you know, all of this. I still don't have the foggiest idea of how the three of you are even wrapped up in this," explained Roland, looking at them suspiciously. "We'll come by your office tomorrow to sort it all out," offered Azalea. Roland reluctantly nodded his head. "If I get reprimanded for this, you must take the fall then. If they ask why you haven't been interviewed, I'll simply tell them that you refused," said Roland. The three knights nodded in agreement. "Well, come on then, you two. I'll point you towards the inn," said Roland, beginning to walk back down the road. William and Eric bowed politely at the three knights, who at this point were already chattering excitedly and leaving in another direction. "What do you suppose they're up to?" asked Eric suspiciously. "I don't care. We're staying at an inn for nobles tonight, Eric," said William excitedly. The two boys shared a sweet moment of unbridled excitement. Even if Eric's plan to get William enrolled wasn't going quite as smoothly as he'd hoped, the two of them had already made it further than they could have ever dreamed on their first day in Oxgate. The Chancellor leaned back in his chair and took a sip of port from his fancy golden goblet, washing down the last of his celebratory turkey dinner. He'd done well. He'd done very well. Not only were all of the next semester's academic programs budgeted, finalized, and signed off, but he'd secured an enormous stipend from a Castilian noble family for a new enrollment in the college. The lion's share of their preposterous international student fees generally ended up in amenities funds. However, with a payout this large, his office would certainly be seeing some new furnishings too. He looked around at the beautiful room bathed in rich mahogany furniture and intricate golden ornaments. For every new foreign noble child that was shipped over here to begin training as a page, the Chancellor would be able to add a new article to its contents. What more did it even need, though? Perhaps a new rug? He was suddenly pulled from his musing as a ruckus began to erupt from downstairs. He sat up anxiously in his chair, listening intently to try to hear what the arguing voices were yelling about. It didn't take long, however, for the argument and accompanying stomping footsteps to work their way directly up to his closed office door. It was thrown open roughly, revealing the last 3 people in the world he wanted to see right now. "Gertrude, I told you not to let them in," growled the Chancellor furiously at his aide, who was standing behind the 3 knights, looking rather flustered. "I tried, sir. I'm sorry," she cried, fluttering about anxiously behind them as she tried to make eye contact with her boss over August's hulking shoulders. "Aha! I told you she was lying." "He is here," exclaimed August, pointing at the Chancellor. "Why are you in my office?" asked the Chancellor furiously, standing up from his desk. "Why are you trying to keep me out?" retorted August, looking around the room suspiciously. "Why do you think?" asked the Chancellor angrily. Azalea squeezed her way past August. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have very important news that can't wait," she explained, bowing her head respectfully to the Chancellor. As Ivar sheepishly joined his comrades, the Chancellor looked over the 3 of them and let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine. Gertrude, close the door," said the Chancellor reluctantly, sitting back down in his chair and rubbing his temples. His aide nodded obediently and closed the door gently behind the knights. "What's so important that it couldn't wait until tomorrow?" asked the Chancellor, looking out of his window at the twilight shadows beginning to fall over his fancy back garden. "We know what to do about the tax problem," declared August confidently. The Chancellor returned to his desk and assessed the 3 of them derisively. "That's not my problem anymore," he said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "What?" exclaimed August. "I had the matter looked into. Such responsibilities do not fall under the purview of my position as Chancellor," he explained smugly. "But it falls under our purview as knights?" asked Ivar, raising an eyebrow. "Of course. A knight's purview is to carry out whatever task the kingdom asks of them. A Chancellor's responsibilities revolve specifically around the workings of the college. They are somewhat more specific, I'm afraid," explained the Chancellor, taking an arrogant sip from his goblet. "The Duke asked for you to be involved directly. We were all there. We all saw it," yelled August. The Chancellor laughed. "I'm afraid that's inconsequential. He simply got caught up in the moment," replied the Chancellor with a shrug. The 3 knights exchanged incredulous looks with one another. "Will you at least hear out our plan?" asked Azalea. The Chancellor shook his head. "I'm afraid it's not my problem. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a hot meal waiting for me at home," lied the Chancellor, subtly nudging his empty plate aside while looking at the knights expectantly. The knights wanted to object, but at this point there was little they could do. He'd really managed to worm his way out of accepting any responsibility for the matter at all. After exchanging a defeated glance, they reticently stood up to leave. "Well, thank you for seeing us anyway," said Azalea politely. The Chancellor nodded his head as he watched the knights turning to leave. "I guess we have no choice then," said Ivar hesitantly to Azalea. "Do you think he'll still be in his office?" asked Azalea. "He's the rector." I'm sure with the college having received such an unprecedented request, he probably has quite a lot on his plate right now, reasoned Ivar on his way out the door. "Wait!" exclaimed the Chancellor suddenly. The three knights stopped in their tracks and turned back to face him expectantly. "The rector, did you say?" asked the Chancellor, his voice cracking. The three knights nodded as he cleared his throat awkwardly. "And you said something about an odd request?" asked the Chancellor curiously. Again the three knights exchanged unsure glances with one another. "We probably shouldn't be discussing the rector's business with other people," said August, bowing his head apologetically. Immediately the Chancellor felt his blood beginning to boil. "It involves the taxation issue too, so, as you said, it's not really your problem. This should probably be kept between the rector and the Duke. Please, just go ahead and enjoy your meal, sir," said Ivar, bowing his head politely before turning to leave. The Chancellor pounded his fist on the desk angrily, causing some of the golden statuettes which littered it to topple over. He instantly realized how uncomely his outburst was and reached out to straighten up the figurines. He looked back up at the three knights and took a deep breath. "All right, get back in here," he said angrily, beckoning for the knights to close the door and come back. The knights obliged him, coming back and sitting down. "Listen, we need to get one thing straight. I'm sick of people thinking that the rector is somehow above me. The only thing he controls is the library. All other college matters are my responsibility. Do you understand?" asked the Chancellor, looking each of them in their eyes intently. hummed Ivar distrustfully. The Chancellor again raised his fist to bang on his table angrily, but caught himself and simply rubbed his bald head in frustration instead. "You said something about an odd request that the college received. If it's a request for the college, it should come straight to my desk, not his," yelled the Chancellor furiously. The three knights feigned surprised glances with one another. "Oh, we didn't know that," lied Azalea. The Chancellor shook his head angrily. "Does he do this a lot, taking college matters into his own hands?" he asked. The three knights shrugged. The Chancellor let out another sigh. "Go on then. Explain the situation to me," said the Chancellor, leaning back in his chair and taking an angry sip from his goblet. And with that, Ivar's plan started to come to fruition as the three knights began to explain William's bizarre trial-by-combat enrollment request. The Chancellor leaned his head on his fists, listening intently to their story. "And so the request has been passed on to the rector, who will surely decline to sign it," finished Ivar, leaning back in his chair, exhausted from his monologue. The Chancellor nodded his head and leaned back in his chair too. He thought about the situation deeply before responding. "I certainly hope you didn't come here expecting me to approve the idea of this trial-by-combat nonsense," said the Chancellor. The idea of a commoner enrolling in his college sent a wave of distaste flowing through his chest. He'd lose the respect of swaths of nobles if he allowed such a thing. "No, sir, of course not. We'd never do that to the rector. We just wanted your counsel on the matter," lied Ivar. The Chancellor immediately bit the bait, staring straight at him, invigorated by his words. "What do you mean? Do what to the rector?" asked the Chancellor curiously. "Well, sir, of course, this whole affair being the result of him not striking outdated clauses from his records, in addition to his staff members not knowing what's written in their own constitution. It's not a good look. It would look even worse if we went above his head and had you sign off on the matter after he's already refused it. Imagine if a commoner was allowed to enroll in the college and it was all because of his oversight. All of the blame could surely only fall on the rector's shoulders, considering the circumstances. All would begin to doubt his prowess," said Ivar, expertly manipulating the Chancellor's mind like a puppeteer. The Chancellor once again took the bait, his eyes lighting up in delight at the mere thought of the idea. "Now hold on a moment," began the Chancellor, standing up and beginning to pace behind his desk, unable to stay still in his excitement. You said that this trial by combat was held between man and monster, yes? Asked the Chancellor, confused. Yes, sir, confirmed Ivar. So how could it be held at all? The gateway has been closed for over a century, said the Chancellor, pausing his pacing for a moment to stare at Ivar quizzically. Here it was. This was where Ivar really needed to get things right. Yes, sir, well, began Ivar, there technically are still gateway monsters crawling about. It's just that they're only in one place. Any knight that has been stationed in the desert has seen them, including us. They're nothing compared to what our ancestors faced, so we typically wouldn't call them gateway monsters, but to those who have never seen one before, they are like horrors straight out of their wildest nightmares. No one from Oxgate has ever seen anything like them, I assure you, explained Ivar. All who set eyes upon the beasts would surely be terrified. I still remember my first time. I felt like running back to Oxgate, added August, the word of one of the kingdom's mightiest warriors, carrying quite some weight on the matter. The Chancellor seemed to be nodding along. He looked almost excited by the idea. Indeed, I had forgotten about those strange desert creatures. The mere descriptions I've heard of those foul beasts is enough to send a chill down my spine just thinking about them. But if we hold a demonstration out in the desert, there's no point in any of this. The only people out there are clerics and knights anyway, thought the Chancellor aloud. That's why we want to bring one of the monsters here, explained Azalea with a confident nod. Bringing a gateway monster to Oxgate? That's madness, exclaimed the Chancellor, flabbergasted. Indeed, we've all sworn an oath in our knighthood that we shall never allow there to be a monster within the walls of Oxgate, agreed Ivar. But this is why we want to hold the event in the barracks. It's outside of Oxgate's walls. The infantry stationed there are all commoners and low nobles, and it already has an arena. This is where the taxation issues might be solvable. Perhaps this is all a serendipity, said Ivar, again capturing the Chancellor's attention. What do you mean? Asked the Chancellor, ceasing his pacing to stare at Ivar, captivated by his words. The barracks is close enough to Oxgate that those nobles who are interested can come and watch. Word about the event would spread quite well. Whether the boy succeeded in his trial or not, the masses should be satisfied that there is still a need for a college, said Ivar. There was a short silence while the Chancellor considered their plan. They had a point. If the people of Oxgate got a first-hand look at one of those monsters, their doubts in the need for the college would surely be largely abated. How exactly would you get one of those beasts to Oxgate? That's not a minor concern. Who would go to the desert to do it? Would it be you? Asked the Chancellor. The three knights exchanged a knowing glance. Slaying one of those monsters is one thing, but capturing it and safely transporting it all the way here, that's a totally different story, said Ivar, shaking his head. The Chancellor nodded in agreement. But, Ivar then began, raising a finger. What if the one man who could do this without a doubt was already out there? What if it was a knight outclassed by none, who the commoners literally sing songs about? Asked Ivar, raising an eyebrow as he saw realization dawning on the Chancellor's face. Surely there's no way he'd come back for something like this, exclaimed the Chancellor, unconvinced. The challenge of wrangling one of those things and bringing it back to Oxgate might be the exact kind of excitement he's looking for, don't you think? Asked August eagerly. The Chancellor thought about their plan. If word spread that he was coming home for this event, that might be enough to get everybody in Oxgate excited about it, thought the Chancellor aloud. This is one of the places where we hit a bit of a wall. How are we supposed to contact him? We don't exactly have Kane's contact details written down. Even when we were students together, the man barely said a word to any one of us except August, explained Ivar. The Chancellor let out a frustrated sigh. I must admit, even I have trouble contacting Kane. Just take a look at his order. It's chaos. His students have barely ever even set eyes on him, his own son included. No matter how many times I write to him, he doesn't seem to care. If he won't even come back to manage his order, what makes you think he cares about the college enough to help us with this?" asked the Chancellor despondently. "Well, if he received a letter from the Duke, perhaps he wouldn't have a choice," thought Ivar aloud. The Chancellor's eyes opened wide in realization. He looked between the three knights suspiciously before leaning back and releasing an impressed sigh. "Well, well, well, you really got me," admitted the Chancellor, shaking his head in disbelief. The three knights feigned ignorance, tilting their heads and looking back at him like three confused, innocent puppy dogs. "You didn't come here for my counsel at all. You just want me to contact the Duke for you," said the Chancellor in disbelief. "Sir, if I may, I know that you said solving this taxation issue was not your problem, but would this not be ideal? It would be cleaning up the mess that the rector has made and at the same time solving a problem for not just the college, but the whole kingdom. How could the Duke look at this in any other light than as an absolute win?" asked Ivar earnestly. The Chancellor seemed intrigued by his words, but still a little unsure. "Listen, if I do this, I need you to give me some assurances," said the Chancellor, filling all three knights with excitement. "Firstly, if it seems like this commoner boy might pass the combat trial, I need you to step in and finish the beast off. I want this event to undoubtedly demonstrate that a knight is needed to combat such a creature. If the boy manages to do it himself, the impact of the event will be diluted. I also need to be able to assure the Duke that no commoners will truly be making their way into the college as a result of this," explained the Chancellor. "He's never even held a blade before, sir. I don't think we need to worry about that," explained Ivar. "He's a very timid boy," agreed Azalea. "One sight of that monster, and he'll be banging at the gate with wet pants," agreed August with a haughty chuckle. The Chancellor seemed relieved to hear this. "Secondly, if anything goes wrong, anything at all, you three will take all of the blame," said the Chancellor, looking at the three of them seriously. For a moment the three knights exchanged an uneasy glance with one another, but after considering their circumstances, reticently nodded in agreement. They didn't have much of a choice. If they didn't want the Duke to reprimand them for the happenings in Mistfall, this was the best solution they had to the taxation problem. The Chancellor suddenly clapped his hands together. "Good. Well then, I have some preparations to make. Firstly, I'll be issuing a formal request to the library that the rector update the college constitution to remove this trial by combat nonsense," said the Chancellor, his eyes gleaming excitedly by the prospect of reprimanding the rector. He suddenly looked up at the knights. "Why are you still here? Go on, get out, I've got work to do," he exclaimed, shooing the three of them out the door. The three knights obliged him happily, taking their leave with polite bows. As they walked out of the Chancellor's office and into the night, they continued their excited babbling about their wildly successful meeting with the Chancellor. The air around them was filled with zest, as even they found themselves excited by the show they were planning to put on in the college's name.